I played the alto saxophone in concert and jazz band back in high school. For the most part, I really liked it. While the school concert band had about 60 kids in it, there were only like 8 of us in jazz band. We typically play in a variety of different venues for jazz band, including the school concerts, but also some music festivals and other competitions. We were never super competitive and always had a good time. However, there was one competition and one encounter that was completely terrifying. It was a snowy Thursday evening in early December, and we all met outside the school at 5 p.m. to board a small school bus that would take us to the competition. Since there wasn't school the next day, a few of us were planning on hanging out after we got back. The place we were going was at another high school and about an hour away, and our director, Mr. Werner, had agreed we could stop for food, on the condition that we ate carefully and didn't get anything on our nice clothes. On the way over, me and some of the other kids stacked up our cases in the aisle and tried to play Egyptian Rat Screw. However, after the bus driver began to have trouble with the snow and the bus slipped a few times, Mr. Werner told us to take our cases back and to stay seated. Eventually we got on a highway that had already been salted, but traffic was moving slowly. Mr. Werner began to worry that we'd be late and called one of the event organizers. Apparently the weather was slowing people from other schools down as well, and they seemed to assure him that us being late wouldn't be a problem. We stopped at an exit that had a subway, which was one of the options Mr. Werner had given us, and luckily we were the only ones there. After the employees had finished making our sandwiches, we got right back on the bus and continued over. At this point it was a little after 6 and pitch black, and the snow was still coming down. I think we ended up getting there around 7 when we were supposed to be there at 6:30, and Mr. Werner told us to hurry getting our stuff, but to try not to slip. As we pulled up to one of the entrances, we appreciated how truly massive this school was. Apparently it was like one of the premier private schools in the area, and the buildings had been built in the 50s or 60s. The main building looked like this giant cube with 2 or 3 stories above ground. Josh, one of the seniors who played trombone, told us how it was even bigger underground, and how he and some of his buddies had played tag and almost gotten lost down there when he was a freshman. Mr. Werner led us into one of the entrances that had signs by it, and we came into this big foyer area that had an information table set up. The lady sitting in the chair apologized for the poor weather and assured Mr. Werner that it was alright. Apparently only 2 of the other 6 bands had arrived at that point too. She directed us down one of the halls and said there would be a classroom with the name of our high school on it, and that would be our base of operations. Mr. Werner thanked her and we all walked away. I guess it was because the building was so old, but the hallways were pretty narrow. Only some of the lights were turned on, maybe to conserve energy, and no one else was in any of the nearby classrooms, making for a rather creepy experience. When we got to our classroom, we went inside and saw it was a science room with those wooden tables with black tops and things like triple beam balances sitting on a back counter. Immediately Mr. Werner cautioned us to not mess with any of the equipment and had us push the chairs together and get out our instruments so we could start to warm up. After a few minutes, someone knocked on the door and Mr. Werner answered it. It was another one of the event organizers, and he came to tell us that they were having technical difficulties with the equipment in the auditorium and that a few of the bands were still on the way. Therefore, the competition start time would be pushed back to 8:30, meaning we had an hour until then. A couple kids started to groan, but a moment later, Alex, the other kid who played the alto sax, asked Mr. Werner if we could explore the school in the meantime. The rest of us immediately got on board, and though Mr. Werner initially seemed reluctant, I think being cooped up in that bus and the stress of the situation made him want to walk around as well. Eventually he agreed, and over our cheering, he told us that we could leave our instruments and coats in the room, but that we need to take our purses and wallets. He also asked us to keep track of how to get back to the room we were in. So Mr. Werner led us out into the hallway, with everyone shouting suggestions on where to go first. Someone wanted to go to the top floor, while the rest of us wanted to go to the bottom. Therefore, we walked further down the hallway we took to get to the room, looking for a stairwell. Eventually we turned the corner, and soon after found one. However, it only went up and not down, so instead we went to the top. It also only went up 1 level, and a few of us debated about whether we were on the top floor or not. All of the classrooms were locked, however we could peek inside the glass in the doors and out through some of the windows on the exterior of the building. Honestly, I couldn't tell if we were on the top floor or not. We kept walking around the hallway, which was roughly in the shape of a square, and on the opposite side from the first stairwell was what I think was the main one. It actually did go up, but at the top was a sign saying it was off limits. Josh actually wanted to try to open the door, since it didn't actually say emergency exit or alarm will sound or anything, but Mr. Warner yelled at him to stop. Josh did manage to put his ear to the door and told us it sounded like it led to the roof, so I guess we were on the top floor. We went back down the staircase, which not only led to the floor we came in on, but 2 floors beneath that. We went all the way down, and similar to the door at the top, the one on the bottom had a sign saying it was off limits as well. Of course, that just made us want to try going through it. This door had a window, and through it we could see just a bit of the hallway, but not much else. Again, Mr. Warner held us back, and instead we went back up 1 flight of stairs and came out at the level under the one with our classroom. I think this level was still in the basement of the building, though this floor was pretty much the same as the others. It was still laid out in one giant square and didn't seem any bigger than the other levels. However, the hallways did have these weird ramps going up and down, and through the doors we saw this one huge, mostly empty room that I think had these props for a play. Eventually we made 1 full loop and came back to the stairwell, and Mr. Warner told us it was time to go back up to our room. I don't think anyone protested, because most of us were tired of walking around at this point. When we got back to our room, we still had like 40 minutes. Then a few minutes later, Mr. Warner left us to go visit with one of the other band directors he knew. He gave us explicit instructions to stay in the room, aside from going to the bathrooms. Then Josh started talking about going back to explore the lowest floor. Alex asked him if that's where he played tag as a freshman, but he said he wasn't sure. Josh tried to convince Stephanie, another senior who played the trumpet, to go with him. She was a rather straight-laced person and was reluctant, but eventually he won her over. The plan was for the rest of us to stay in the room, and if Mr. Warner came back, to tell him that they just went to the bathroom. 10 or so minutes passed, and we started getting worried Mr. Warner would come back and have us start practicing soon. Alex and I threw out the idea of going to check on them, and asked if anyone else wanted to do it. No one did. Partly out of my own curiosity, and because we didn't want it to seem suspicious that too many people were gone, I went there by myself. I walked over to the stairwell, being on the lookout for Mr. Warner or anyone else, but I didn't see anyone. I opened the door and went down 1 level to where we had been before, just on the off chance that Josh and Stephanie were there instead. I looked through the window in the door and didn't see anything. Then I propped it open a bit and listened and didn't hear anything. Therefore, I went all the way down to the bottom level. The door at the bottom had a more narrow window, and I could see just a tiny bit of the hallway on the other side, but I didn't see them. I opened the door, still slightly paranoid an alarm would go off, but it didn't. This one was rather heavy and made a squeaking sound. After I got it open, I walked into the hallway, listening for Josh and Stephanie. I still didn't hear them, but there was a low mechanical rumbling, and the air down here was a few degrees warmer. I guess this was where the boilers were. Unlike the other levels, this one didn't appear to have classrooms, and the hallways just stretched on in both directions. The level was also dimmer than the others, with gently humming fluorescent lights overhead every 15 feet or so. All at once I started to get a bit creeped out, and I just wanted to find Josh and Stephanie and go back up. I kept listening, but I still couldn't hear them, so then I began walking down one side of the hallway. Eventually I passed a few locked doors, and though none of them were labeled, I could hear machines on the other side. Even though this seemed like the spot where the hallway should have turned right, it kept going straight for a while, so I guess this floor was laid out a bit differently. When I got to the end, there was an opening on the right side, but it was to a big storage room completely filled with boxes. It crossed my mind that Josh and Stephanie could be waiting to scare me, and I called out, "I see you guys," even though I didn't see or hear them. No one answered, and aside from the low mechanical hum, it was completely silent. I peeked between some of the boxes, and it seemed like there might be a hallway on the other side, but I didn't want to start moving things. Instead, I called out, "You guys need to come back now," on the off chance they were there, and then I turned around to check the other end of the hallway. As I walked back by the door, I decided to open it in case they were hiding on the other side, but to my horror, it wouldn't. My heart started to race, and I began knocking and yelling for someone to open up. Then I tried to call Alex, but there wasn't reception on my phone. I started to feel a bit lightheaded and took a step backwards. Well, there was one way left to go, so after a few moments I started walking down the other side of the hallway. As I was going away from the machines, it got quieter, and I couldn't hear anything else. Eventually the hallway turned left, but instead of leading to a storage room, there was what appeared to be a lunchroom. It had those classic long rectangular tables with the attached benches on each side. Unlike the hallway, this room didn't have any lights on, so most of it was shrouded in darkness. I figured this was where John and Stephanie were hiding. I stopped walking and was as quiet as possible, but I still couldn't hear anything over the low rumble coming from down the hallway. I called out, "You guys need to come back," only for the words to echo in the darkness without a reply. I felt my heart start to race again. I really didn't want to go in there, even though there might have been a way out. However, before I could deliberate further, I saw someone. At the end of one of the tables, just at the edge of darkness, it looked like a man was sitting. I couldn't tell if he was reading something or looking down at a phone, but honestly it was probably too dark to read, and I didn't see any light coming from an electronic device. It didn't seem like he was eating anything either. He stayed motionless, and I couldn't make out any of his features, and I almost thought he was a mannequin, like a prop for a play. But just then he sprang up and started running towards me. I have no words to describe what I felt in that moment, and the experience was completely surreal. I sprinted back down the hallway and yanked on the door handle with all my might. Miraculously, it opened. I guess it hadn't been locked before, just very hard to open. I didn't even turn back to look down the hallway, instead racing up the stairs to the level I came in on. I ran back to the band room, and though Mr. Warner wasn't there, Josh and Stephanie were. As they tell me later, Josh had changed his mind and wanted to go to the roof, but when the door didn't open, they walked back down to our level and just went to the bathrooms. When I came in the door, everyone immediately acknowledged my presence as I was clearly out of breath and running for my life. Before saying anything, I closed the door behind me and turned the lights out. Several people started yelling, and Josh asked me what the hell I was doing. I explained between breaths how I went to the basement to look for them, and then some random guy was just sitting on a bench and ran after me. Josh said, "Oh shit," and walked up to the door next to me. There wasn't a way to lock it, so I'd been holding my foot against it while trying to peek out slightly through the window. Now, if anyone else in our band had done something like this, the rest of us might not have believed them. But I didn't tend to play a lot of jokes, and I'm pretty sure everyone else could gauge by my reaction that I was being genuine. In that moment, I don't think any of us knew what to do. If I told someone what happened, then I could get in trouble, and I wouldn't even be able to give a description of that man. But at least people could be on the lookout for someone suspicious and possibly dangerous. We basically stayed like this for 5 minutes before someone came up from the other side of the hallway and tried to open the door. It was just Mr. Werner. Immediately upon entering, he thought we were playing a joke since the lights were off, and turned the lights back on and told us to get ready. I guess he didn't pick up on the fact that some of us were genuinely afraid. While I was still debating what to do, Josh had a clever idea that was honestly probably the best way to handle things. He mentioned to Mr. Werner that when we went down to the basement before, he thought he saw some man running down the hallway there, and the main reason he wanted to go in was to see who that guy was. Mr. Werner was surprised, and asked why Josh didn't mention it before. Josh said that the group had started to walk back up at that point, so he didn't have a chance to say it, and then added that the guy looked kind of crazy, and he wondered if he was alright. I don't think Mr. Werner knew what to do with that information, and ultimately he told us just to be careful and stick together as we went through the hallways. Though we had to leave our instrument cases in the room, Mr. Werner did agree to hold on to people's purses and other valuable items. He put them in this little portable file holder that he often carried with him, and after that we left the classroom and went to the auditorium. Stepping back into the hallway was kind of nerve-wracking, and as I looked back down the hallway at the door to the stairwell, I expected that guy to bust out any moment. Thank God he didn't. The rest of the night went pretty much how we expected it. We played our 3 songs to a small audience of band directors and parents and relatives. We ended up placing 3rd, though there were only 4 bands that made it. Things finally wrapped up around 10 o'clock, and we went back to the room to pack up our instruments. I felt my heart rate rise a bit, but as we were all together and about to leave, I was a bit more relaxed. Nothing inside the room looked like it had been tampered with, and 2 minutes later we walked back to the main entrance area. The boys and girls each went as a respective group to the bathroom, and though Josh was joking at this point that the guy would be waiting for us in one of the stalls, no one else was there. Then we walked outside, and a gust of cold wind and snow smacked us in the face. It might have been below 0 at this point, and we quickly made our way back to the bus where the driver was already waiting for us. Like before, most of us sat in the back, and when we were out of earshot of Mr. Werner, people started prying me for details again. I didn't have anything else to say at that point, other than reiterating that I thought Josh and Stephanie had been messing with me down there. As the bus started to pull out of the parking lot, and the conversation shifted to if we still wanted to hang out after we got back, there was one final bizarre twist. Alex got my attention and started pointing back at the building and said he thought that that was the room we had been using. I looked where he was pointing, which did appear to be our room, and I saw a silhouette of someone standing at one of the windows. When my son was in the first grade, I volunteered to help out with their field day. I wasn't sure what all that would entail, but I ended up helping set up and then take down different pieces of gym equipment for obstacle courses and other outside activities. I had a good time watching my son Sam and the other kids run around and talking to other parents. Eventually everyone went back inside for some kind of assembly, while me, the PE teacher, and another dad who volunteered to help clean up were still outside. We were almost done collecting gym mats and these wooden squares with wheels on the bottom, when one of the teachers appeared at the door and motioned for the PE teacher to come back inside. We did a quick check, and I spotted the parachute still spread out on the ground by the playground. The teacher was already pushing a large cart, and the other dad had his arms full with some of the mats, so I went to get it. They thanked me, and the teacher told me to just set it inside the supply room where we had gotten things out from earlier. I walked to the other side of the blacktop towards the playground, and was only a few feet away when I thought I heard a noise. It sounded like a shoe slipping on a plastic tube. I looked up at the playground, which had stairs, slides, places to climb up, and some monkey bars, as well as one section of tubing. But I didn't see anyone on it, minus the inside of the tube, which I couldn't see. I couldn't tell if I had just imagined hearing the sound, but if not, that meant that someone was hiding in that tube. Now you might be wondering why I was even scared, especially since everyone in my son's school is like 6 years old. But there was just something about the atmosphere. I was completely alone between the blacktop and the playground, and while there had just been a lot of noise and laughter, now it was almost dead silent. I decided to call out, "Anyone there?" No one answered. I debated about whether or not to go back to get the PE teacher to help me check the playground, but since I only had to check one place, I felt silly. I took a few steps around the side and looked in, but was not at all prepared for what I saw. There was a filthy older woman smiling at me and holding a knife. She looked to be in her 50s or 60s, and her hair was matted with dirt. I jumped back instinctively, and the woman started screaming incomprehensibly and waving the knife. However much I hate to admit it, I turned and ran. I ran all the way back to the back door and came inside, and the first teacher I ran into, I explained what just happened. She started freaking out as well, and called the office while she went back to make sure everyone was inside and locked the doors. The school actually went into lockdown and the cops were called. I made my way into the gym where all the kids had been assembled. By that time, other teachers started to overhear what was going on, and the adults in the room were on edge. On the other hand, a lot of the kids were excited that something unusual was happening. I managed to find Sam and sat next to him. 20 minutes later, the principal and another teacher came in and made an announcement that the situation was all clear. As it was close to the end of the school day, students would be dismissed directly from the gym, or their parents could pick them up. I took Sam home with me, and on the way out I asked some of the teachers for more details, but they weren't able to provide any. Needless to say, my wife was shocked when I told her there was some crazy lady hiding out in the playground, and all I could tell her was that the police took care of it. Later that evening, the school sent out an email, though it didn't go into much detail beyond what I told to the staff, and the fact that the cops apprehended the woman. Only later, during a school board meeting, did we find out that the police had actually recognized the woman. Her name was Sandra Smith, and she lived with a few other people in a group home nearby. Apparently she had a history of brandishing knives, though she never attacked anyone. A few of the parents, myself included, were upset that she was able to get that close to a school in the first place. Very long story short, she was able to be moved further away, to another place that could monitor her more effectively. Though we considered pulling Sam out for a short time after this incident took place, he did end up attending all the way through 5th grade before moving to the nearby junior high. I'll still never forget this experience, and the image of seeing that woman screaming in my face and waving a knife. And I'm just glad that nothing bad happened to any of the kids, including Sam. As I sat down to share the story, I realized again how bizarre it was. It's the strangest thing I've ever experienced, And I don't know if I was in any danger, and if so, how much. The whole thing seems off, like a page from a book shoved between 2 pages of another book, but I'll share it anyway. This happened my freshman year in high school when our chess team was going to a tournament. All nerdy jokes aside, it was actually incredibly chill. 2 of my good friends joined with me, and the rest of the people were cool as well. Our coach was one of the math teachers, Mrs. Paulson, and while I don't think she was ever super into chess or played competitively herself, she seemed to enjoy hosting us. Most of the tournaments we went to were on Saturdays, and since we usually didn't make the finals, we typically leave in the early afternoon. We normally meet at our school around 6 or so, then take one of the school buses over to wherever the tournament was, almost always at another high school. If we had time, we'd sometimes stop off somewhere and get donuts or other breakfast food, though on this particular Saturday we did not. I remember this was one of the bigger tournaments, and it wasn't actually at a school. Instead, it was at this new convention center near another city, and it was a good 2-hour drive. Like usual, we all joked on the way over, and at one point I started to work on some of the homework I brought with me. However, right before we got there, I noticed this strange, salty taste in my mouth, even though I hadn't eaten or drunk anything. For whatever reason, it seemed stronger whenever I'd breathe in or out through my teeth. I'd never noticed anything like it before, but after 10 minutes or so, I guess I started to get used to it, and I didn't think anything else of it. When our bus pulled into one of the parking lots, there were already several buses there. I helped carry some of the chessboards, clocks, and other material, as we all filed off and made our way to one of the entrances. It had this row of sliding glass doors under a curved steel awning, and it led into a large rectangular room with a sloping ceiling that had a row of skylights on one side. I remember almost the entire room was lit up orange from the rising sun. There were several tables with volunteers sitting at them, and a few other teams checking in. After we finished checking in ourselves, we walked through a set of doors on the opposite side of the room, and into this long hallway that led to various rooms on either side. Eventually we came to one of the rooms that the organizer told us we could use as a home base. It was another rectangular room, a bit smaller than the first, and it had rows of tables and chairs. A few other teams had already staked out some territory, but there was plenty of open space left, and we set up near one of the corners. After that, we walked back into the hallway and found the room where the matches would be held, which was similar to the room in which we entered the building. By that time, it was around 8:30, and since the first match didn't even start until 9:30, we had some time. The juniors and seniors on our team recognized a few kids from other schools, and they started hanging out with them. The rest of us walked back to the prep room, where one of my friends, Kyle, started playing one of the Command & Conquer games on his laptop, while the rest of us started spectating. Eventually I felt an urge to get up and walk around, partly out of curiosity to explore the building, and I told them I'd see them later. I stepped back into the hallway, and here is where things started to get strange. I couldn't put my finger on it, but somehow the hallway looked different. Maybe it had seemed shorter or smaller before, and though it still had overhead lights on, it looked dim. That's when I noticed someone standing at one end, underneath one of those exit signs. They were looking away, so I couldn't see their face, but they looked like another high school kid. I decided to head in that direction, since I hadn't been there before, and as I approached, the other person didn't appear to move. I almost got the sense that they were waiting for me. When I got close to the end of the hallway, I saw it lead out into a larger room. Exactly how large, I wasn't sure. I saw the person was another boy about my same age, with short blonde hair and wearing a polo shirt and cargo shorts. He was just staring out into the room. Though in retrospect I found it to be a bit odd, I wasn't really creeped out at this point, and I decided to acknowledge his presence by saying hey. The kid turned to me and smiled, and stuck out his hand and introduced himself as Jeremy. The fact that he offered a handshake was a bit strange, but I shook his hand and introduced myself as Luke. Jeremy asked if I'd been here before, and I shook my head no. I asked him the same question, and he nodded. Then Jeremy asked if I wanted to go exploring, and I said yeah. Jeremy started walking into the larger room and motioned with his arm for me to follow him, so I did. As we walked out into the room, I was taken aback at just how big it was. It was easily twice the size of the original entrance room. But it was also dimly lit and completely empty. I turned to Jeremy and said something like, "This is huge," and he told me to come on. We continued to walk to the opposite side, and walked through another door that led into another hallway. Jeremy turned the corner and immediately started walking down one side, and I continued to follow along. I asked him if he knew where this led, but Jeremy didn't seem to acknowledge that. After another 10 seconds or so, he turned and went through a door that led to a bigger hallway / reception type area. Without missing a beat, he kept walking forward. This is about where I started to feel uneasy. I asked Jeremy where he was going, but instead of looking at me and giving an answer, he just picked up the pace. He was practically speed walking at this point, and while I wasn't out of breath, I wanted to stop for a moment and look around. I asked him again, and this time Jeremy legit took off running. I decided to stop following him, and instead just stood there, watching him disappear down this oddly shaped room. While this story takes place years ago, after having played the game Animoyapolis recently, I can see an eerie similarity between this place and the business center level in the game. Eventually Jeremy turned and walked into another door somewhere, and I was left there, alone. I wanted to go back, but for some reason I couldn't will myself to turn around. After a few seconds I began to move, but right as I did so, I saw the thing. It was at least 8 feet tall, and its arms were wiry thin and stretched out to the sides, and it seemed like it came out of the same room that Jeremy had gone into. I couldn't make out more than that as I started running back the way I came. When I got into the room leading back to the hallway, I looked over my shoulder, and though I didn't see anything, I didn't stop. Eventually I made it back to where the rest of my team was, still huddled around Kyle's computer. It's hard to describe what I felt in that moment, but looking back, one of the weirdest and most disturbing things was that I wasn't scared. At least, I didn't feel scared when I was back with my friends. I considered telling them about it, and almost did, but as they were engrossed in another activity and a good moment didn't present itself, I didn't. Eventually Mrs. Paulson came and got us around 9:20, and we all walked into the main room and sat down at our boards. We didn't make it to the finals, which wasn't surprising, though I did win 4 of my 5 matches on board 5, and apparently got some kind of recognition at the award ceremony. We didn't stay for it. Mrs. Paulson just let me know at our next practice. In between matches, we'd usually go back to that room where we'd set our stuff down, but I never went back to the end of the hallway. We finished all our matches by around 2 p.m. and got back on the buses soon after, and the ride back was uneventful. Over the following weeks, I thought more about how surreal that experience was. But what was most bizarre and disturbing was how I felt, or rather, how I didn't feel. One thing you might have been wondering was, what happened to Jeremy? Though he had pretty much just run off, I still left him there with that thing, without telling anyone about it or trying to see if he was alright. And I did that for the entire time we were there. Now maybe you suspected that Jeremy was connected with that thing, like maybe he put on a costume, or that was one of his friends and they were messing with me. And maybe that's what I thought too, but I can't really remember. What I did pick up on was the fact that my heart was racing that afternoon, and even when I woke up the next day. I also realized that the salty taste was gone by the time I got home, but I'm not sure when exactly it stopped. Now, the story doesn't quite end there. 2 years later, I went to see my then-girlfriend Megan's cheerleading competition, which was being held at that same place. I felt a few emotions driving over, including fear, but mostly curiosity, and I fully intended to find that same place where I saw that thing. When I pulled off the highway, I noticed the convention center didn't look as big as I remembered it. I decided to drive around the parking lots that encircled it, and surprisingly, it didn't seem that big at all. I parked close to where we had gone in before, and walked through that same entrance. Things looked similar to how they did for the chess tournament, including the volunteers sitting at tables in that entry room. I didn't check in or ask directions, and didn't want to bother Megan, who was probably practicing with her team, so instead I just walked to that same hallway. There was the exit sign at the end, and my heart started to race as I walked towards it. Soon enough the door came into view. I looked inside and was dumbfounded. There was the room, or maybe I should say a room. Though this time it was apparently where some of the cheer teams were setting up. It was a lot smaller than I remembered. Smaller even than the first room by the entrance. Instead of the dim overhead lights, this room was clearly lit, and it also had skylights. I replayed my memories and knew that they hadn't been there before. Now thoroughly confused, I wandered inside and started to make my way over to that second door that Jeremy and I had gone through. I got to the opposite wall, and tiptoeing between various people and bags, I walked across the length of it, but that door wasn't there. Just then Megan and two of her friends found me and started laughing, joking that I was stalking them. Apparently they'd also set up in the area, but I hadn't noticed them. I smiled and laughed too, but Megan picked up on the fact I had been doing something else. I hadn't told her about what I experienced before. I hadn't told anyone. But later that day I described what happened to her, and she was stunned. I know the only logical explanation is that I had a hallucination. I suspect the salty taste and my heart beating fast had something to do with it, but I have no idea how. Megan insisted that I see a doctor, but as it had been 2 years ago at that point, and I never had another one of these episodes, I decided not to. I was also still on my parents' health insurance, and didn't want to worry my mom or freak her out if I didn't have to. Maybe I'll mention this to my doctor someday, and if it happens again I'll definitely let him know, but for now I seem to be fine. However, the most disturbing part of this, for me at least, was how seamlessly I went from the real world to what must have been my imagination. There weren't any blackouts or blinding flashes of light, at least not that I can remember. I just saw Jeremy standing there at the end of the hallway, and then we turned and walked into the room. And that's another thing. I assumed Jeremy was part of the hallucination, as well as whatever that entity was supposed to be. But perhaps the scariest aspect of all is, if something like this happened again, would I even know? In the end, I'm glad I have a good life, and my mind seems to be alright now. And I thank God for that every day.